Just one sentence and everything shattered. "Don't come to my wedding, Mom. You embarrass me." That wasn't said in a moment of anger. It wasn't blurted out during a heated argument. No, it was spoken in a calm, almost cold voice, as if my son, the very child I raised with all my heart for over 30 years, had never truly seen me as part of his life. Right before his wedding, he looked at me, the mother who built the very life he now enjoys, and delivered that sentence like a verdict. As if a lifetime of love and sacrifice had become something shameful to him. I stood there in the quiet living room, my hands trembling not from age, but from a tidal wave of memories crashing in. Nights I stayed awake by his hospital bed when he had pneumonia at 4. The years I juggled 2 jobs just to pay for his college. The warm hugs he used to give me when he was a little boy. All of it now faded in the eyes of the man who was about to walk down the aisle without wanting his mother to be there. Welcome to Sarah Stories, a channel where we share true tales of family, heartbreak, and the quiet tragedies no one talks about but happen all around us. And today's story, it will shake you. My son was about to host the grandest wedding Colorado had ever seen. Picturesque landscapes, fresh blooming flowers, soft chamber music, glamorous guests, and no seat for the groom's mother. I was told, not asked, that I wasn't welcome. I made people uncomfortable. I dressed out of touch, looked too old, didn't fit into his modern world. So I should stay away. It was his wedding, and I, the woman who built the very house he grew up in, who paid the down payment for the venue, was not on the guest list. But there was something my son didn't know. The wedding venue he thought he rented, it was never truly rented. Because it was never owned by someone else. I was the one who owned that land. I, the mother cast aside, was the legal owner of that entire estate. And in the final moment, as my son stood beside his bride, to be with hundreds of eyes watching, waiting for him to say his vows, I shut down the wedding. The doors locked, the music stopped, the flowers fell from their arches. Gasps echoed through the crowd. And when he turned around, confused and stunned, trying to understand what just happened, I stepped forward from the very last row. Not for revenge, but to remind him there are some things you don't erase, some bonds you don't betray. Today's story is a wake-up call, about gratitude, about family, and about the line a mother draws when she's been pushed too far, not for herself, but for the dignity of a love that should never have been denied. If you believe that family should never be a place for betrayal, then please hit subscribe to Sarah Stories. Your support gives us strength to keep telling real, emotional stories, slices of life that may just change the way you see what truly matters in this world. Elaine Foster, 66, never imagined that one day, the very son she had poured her entire heart into raising would become the person who made her feel most out of place in her own life. A widow and once renowned architect, Elaine was the visionary behind Evergreen Estate, a wedding venue fondly known as the hidden gem of Vermont's mountains. This place wasn't just her final professional achievement, it was the last living piece of her soul after her husband, the man who had stood by her side through 30 years of love and struggle, passed away from heart disease. Evergreen Estate wasn't built with money, it was built with love. Every cobblestone, every flower lining the white painted fences, every lantern hung along the path was the result of countless late nights where Elaine sat sketching designs under a dim lamp, her hands sore after long days at the construction site. While others chose rest, she chose to dream of creating a place that wasn't just for business, but for the celebration of love itself. And when her son Brandon was still a child, that very estate was his playground. He ran barefoot through the grass, hid behind the rustling trees, and laughed amid the joyful weddings his mother worked tirelessly to bring to life. Elaine used to think, one day, Brandon will get married here. She held on to that hope like a cherished dream, never suspecting that when that day finally arrived, it would come with a bitter taste. Brandon, now 32, had grown into a successful creative director in New York, confident, well-dressed, and noticeably colder than he once was. He was set to marry Natalie, the daughter of an affluent family from Boston. Natalie was beautiful, sharp, impeccably dressed, and always spoke like she was at a cocktail party rather than a family dinner. Elaine didn't hate her, but she felt the distance, the invisible wall. From the very first meeting, Elaine could sense it. Natalie didn't see her as a future mother-in-law, but as someone different. Too rustic, too southern, too outdated for the polished world Natalie was accustomed to. Elaine still remembered that first dinner. She had shared stories of her hard work building Evergreen, and Natalie simply smiled politely, speared another piece of salad, and changed the topic to a wedding castle in Italy her friend had rented. After that, the small dismissals began to pile up. Natalie declined Elaine's gift, a turquoise necklace passed down from Elaine's mother-in-law. "Thank you, but it's a bit rough for my style," she'd said. She hired a wedding planner from Boston and rejected every one of Elaine's suggestions, even the gentle comment that red ribbons didn't match the season's lavender theme. So Elaine grew quiet. She stepped back not because she didn't want to be involved in her son's big day, but because she felt herself slowly being pushed out of his life. Evergreen Estate, once her sanctuary of love, had become a stage where she was no longer welcome. Then came the unthinkable. During a final family meeting to confirm wedding details, as the planner outlined the ceremony schedule, Elaine gently asked, "And where will the groom's mother be seated for photos with the couple?" Brandon paused. His eyes avoided hers. Then slowly, he spoke. "Mom, I think maybe you shouldn't be at the wedding." Elaine couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her face went pale. But Brandon continued, voice cracking slightly. "It's not that I don't want you there. It's just Natalie's guests are particular. She said your presence might make things awkward. You know your southern charm and all." That was all Elaine needed to hear. It wasn't Natalie's bluntness that stung, it was the fact that Brandon, the boy who once ran across this lawn, who once cried in her arms after a bad day at school, who once wrote her a birthday card that said, "You're my hero, Mom," was now ashamed of her. He didn't see his mother as a source of pride. She had become an embarrassment, a threat to his image in front of the bride's side of the aisle. Elaine didn't cry. She simply walked out of the room, her hand clutching an old photo frame of her late husband taken the day they opened Evergreen Estate. She knew then that not all wounds bleed. Some pain is quiet, persistent, and deep, like realizing the child you devoted your life to protecting has forgotten where he came from. But she didn't get angry. She didn't lash out. Because in the heart of a seasoned mother, there are pains deeper than tears, and sometimes the most powerful response requires no shouting at all. She returned to her small room on the hill, the one with the old drafting table, her husband's design sketchbook, and the original blueprint of Evergreen Estate. She brewed a pot of tea, opened an old land deed, and smiled a smile softer than any she had worn in years, yet filled with meaning. Because she knew something Natalie had never cared to ask, and something Brandon had clearly forgotten. Evergreen Estate, the venue they had so proudly rented for their grand wedding, had never been sold. Elaine was still the legal owner. And if she needed to, she could do something none of them expected. Not to destroy her son's happiness, but to protect herself, to defend her dignity, and to remind them both of the roots they once called sacred. Because Elaine still believed sometimes, when a mother goes silent, it's not out of weakness. It's because she's preparing a lesson her children will never forget. Elaine stood in front of the antique mirror in her bedroom, her hands gently adjusting the collar, smoothing out the fine wrinkles of the linen dress she often wore whenever guests came to visit Evergreen Estate. The afternoon light filtered through the window, casting a glow on the strands of silver in her neatly combed hair. Her face was calm, composed, but deep within her eyes was a silent ocean, still and vast, waiting for the storm to break. That morning, the family meeting took place in a luxury hotel in Boston. The walls were paneled in rich walnut, crystal chandeliers swayed lightly above, reflecting the polite smiles of those present, everything arranged like a stage, perfectly set, just waiting for the final role to step in. Elaine was there, quietly seated at the far end of the long table, nearly invisible among strangers, lost in a world where people spoke in area codes, academic titles, and investment ratios. Across from her sat Natalie, the future daughter, in law with her refined beauty and chill in her veins. Natalie spoke with the tone of someone raised in exclusive boarding schools, carrying herself with the authority of someone who always knew she belonged at the top. From the very beginning, Natalie barely looked at Elaine. Even when she smiled, it was only for the wedding planner, her mother Judith, or the servers pouring wine. Elaine kept a faint smile on her face, like someone listening to a story she already knew the ending to, like someone who had accepted her role as merely a figure behind the curtain. And then it happened. Natalie looked up, gently set down her glass of water, turned to Brandon, Elaine's only son, and asked, as casually as one might ask about the salad options, "Brandon, do we have to invite your mom to the reception? It's delicate." The words landed on the table like a velvet-wrapped dagger, not loud, not cruel, but sharp enough to cut through a mother's pride and presence in her own son's wedding. And the most painful part, Brandon didn't say a word. He simply looked at Natalie and nodded. Elaine saw that moment, and she knew. She didn't need to hear anything else. Later that day, Brandon called from the car. His voice was even, as if reporting a change in a business schedule. "Mom, maybe just skip this one. It's not personal, it's just better this way." Elaine stood on the balcony of her lodge, phone pressed to her ear. The October breeze whispered through her hair, carrying away the breath she didn't know she had been holding. She was silent for a few seconds. then calmly replied, I see. Thanks for your honesty. She said nothing else, no questions, no blame, not even a sigh. But inside her something collapsed. It wasn't trust that had begun to erode years ago, when Brandon grew distant, when phone calls dwindled, when hugs felt like obligations. It wasn't love, because a mother's love, once formed, never dies. What crumbled that day was the final shred of innocence she had left, the quiet hope that if she was kind enough, sacrificial enough, patient enough, her son would never deny her. The room around her seemed to shrink in the sudden chill. The photos on the wall, Brandon at age 3, Brandon's high school graduation, Brandon standing with her at the Evergreen Estate's opening, seemed to watch her, question her, ache for her. Elaine didn't cry. No tears, no curses. She simply set the phone down, pulled a chair to the window and sat, one arm wrapped around the other, as if to keep herself from shaking, from breaking, from falling apart. Outside, the maple leaves had begun to turn. Wedding season had arrived. Evergreen Estate, the place she had poured every drop of sweat and soul into for 20 years, was preparing for its biggest wedding of the year, her own son's. And bitterly, she was not invited. She had designed every inch of that place, laid every stone of the walkway, angled the windows just so the golden sunlight would strike the aisle at the perfect moment. Now, the woman who had envisioned it all was being erased from the picture she had painted herself. A wedding without a mother. A ceremony perfect in the eyes of the world, yet hollow in the heart of the one cast aside. Elaine sat for a long time, letting every emotion wash over her in silence. Then she stood. She walked to her bookshelf and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the official deed to Evergreen Estate. Her name still etched there, clear, valid, untouched, like a quiet truth that no one could erase. She held the box and ran her fingers gently over its edges. There were no tears in her eyes now, only clarity. A stillness that held power, not vengeance, but choice. A mother can endure many things, but not humiliation from the child she gave life to. She placed the box on the table and dusted it off. Her gaze sharpened, just like it had years ago, back when she wore a hard hat on sight, overseeing every inch of her dream as it rose from the dirt. She knew now, the real confrontation wouldn't happen in a hotel meeting room, nor through a cold phone call. The real battle would arrive on the wedding day. And this time, Elaine would not be standing in the background. Under the maple trees whose leaves had begun to fall early in Vermont, Elaine Foster walked slowly along the stone path leading to the heart of Evergreen Estate, the place that was once the cozy wooden home she and her late husband had built together in their youth. The mountain breeze slipped gently through the trees, brushing through her graying hair like a whisper of the past, of years of tireless work, of deep love, and of the quiet solitude that had stretched across more than 3 decades. Elaine had once been a promising architect, invited to join a prestigious firm in New York, but she chose instead to follow Richard, a modest Vermont man, to begin a new life together in this secluded corner of the world. They purchased a forgotten patch of land nestled deep in the woods, where there was nothing but rocks, weeds, and the sound of howling winds. But for Elaine, it was the perfect place to start a real dream. Together they designed their first house, Richard cutting each plank of wood by hand, and Elaine carefully sketching every line. But that shared dream lasted just over 10 years before tragedy struck. Richard died suddenly in a tree fall accident while working in their backyard. The day he died, Vermont's sky was just as gray as it was now. Brandon, their son, was only 10 at the time, too young to understand the weight of loss. But Elaine understood it all too well, and she knew she had no choice but to keep going. To survive, to raise her son, and more than that, to preserve the soul of Richard that still lingered in their home. So she made a decision: she would turn the house into a wedding venue. She named it Evergreen Estate, forever green, just like the love she believed they had shared. The early years were painfully hard. Elaine had to do everything herself: apply for business permits, learn event design, order fresh flowers, and even scrub toilets after guests had left. She was the first to arrive each morning and the last to leave late at night. On snowy afternoons when the cold bit through her gloves, she'd still step outside to tuck in a few wildflowers before a ceremony, her hands numb and shaking. Brandon grew up in that environment, amid wedding bouquets, waltz music, the scent of cakes, and the emotional vows of couples promising forever. He loved every wedding. He'd run around in a tiny tuxedo, help his mother set chairs, polish glasses, and carry trays. And each time, he'd say the same thing, over and over: "Mom, when I get married, I'll have it right here." Elaine kept that promise close to her heart. Even during the lean years, when finances were tight and she nearly had to sell Evergreen, she fought to hold on, because the place wasn't just work or income. It was a piece of her soul, of Richard's spirit, and of Brandon's childhood. She never expected Brandon to follow in her footsteps. He was a creative, talented man. When he said he wanted to move to Boston for work, Elaine had supported him wholeheartedly. Even if her heart ached a little, she believed truly that the love he had for her and for Evergreen would remain unchanged. She believed that when he got married, the only place he'd consider was the one he had grown up in. But slowly, those beliefs began to unravel. Natalie, the beautiful, poised daughter of a wealthy Boston family, had made her coldness known from the very first meeting. She looked around Evergreen like it was quaint at best and outdated at worst. When Elaine offered to show her old photos of past weddings held there, Natalie had merely smirked and said, "Oh, cute, but I'm not sure it fits our aesthetic." Elaine smiled softly, saying nothing. She understood not everyone appreciated emotional value, but she hadn't expected that, just a few weeks later, Natalie would speak so bluntly during a family meeting. "Brandon, do we really have to invite your mom to the reception? It's delicate." Brandon said nothing. Elaine, sitting quietly at the end of the table, heard every word like a blade carving deep into her chest. But she didn't react. She didn't ask him anything. She didn't cry. Later that day, Brandon called, his voice flat, rehearsed. "Mom, maybe just skip this one. It's not personal, it's just better this way." Elaine didn't say much. She simply let out a soft smile, thin as the morning mist, and replied, "I see. Thanks for your honesty." No one knew she stayed up the entire night after that call. She walked alone through the grounds of Evergreen, the same grounds once filled with her son's laughter, and asked herself, how did we come to this? Evergreen was the place Brandon once called home, the place where he had drawn his imaginary wedding map in crayon as a boy, the place where he held her hand and proudly declared, "When I get married, I want everyone to know my mom built this." And now, on the cusp of his real wedding, there was no place for her, not because of anything she did, but because his fiancé thought she didn't fit the image. Elaine didn't blame Natalie. The young woman knew nothing of this place of love, of loss, or the weight of memory. But she felt a deep disappointment in Brandon, not because she was excluded from the guest list, but because he had forgotten. Forgotten that the place he came from was built from his mother's blood and tears. Forgotten the promise he made as a child, the only promise a mother carries with her for 30 years. And so, in the quiet of an early autumn morning, as sunlight filtered through the brown shingled rooftop, Elaine stood at the large wooden gate leading to the main hall. She reached out, touched the old carved sign that read, Evergreen Estate, and exhaled. From deep within her heart, she knew no one could strip away her dignity, and no one could decide who was worthy to stand in this place. And if they had chosen to erase her from the wedding day, then she, the rightful owner of this entire estate, had the right to choose for herself. And perhaps it was time for Evergreen to no longer be a backdrop for hollow vows, but a stage for justice, for a mother who had been forgotten. Under the soft veil of an October morning mist, the Vermont mountains wore an unusual stillness. Crimson maple leaves blanketed the hillsides, and the wind weaved through every branch, playing a quiet symphony of autumn, a song of nostalgia and slow-burning sorrow. Evergreen Estate, over 3 hectares of land where Elaine Foster had poured her life's devotion, stood quietly, like an old friend bearing witness to countless changing leaves, wedding vows, and unspoken tears. But today the air felt heavier, not because of the wind, not because of the sky, but because a decision had been made, a decision born from silence and a dignity that had been taken for granted. Brandon Foster, Elaine's only son, had just signed the contract to rent Evergreen Estate for his upcoming wedding to Natalie, his fiancée. They had chosen this very place for their vows, unaware that the true owner of Evergreen, the one who held the deed, the heart, and the history, was the woman they had crossed off the guest list, Elaine Foster, mother of the groom. Elaine had done nothing to interfere. From the moment she learned that Brandon and Natalie had submitted a booking request to Evergreen, she said not a word. She didn't protest. She didn't question. She revealed no sign that she was the legal owner of the estate. Through Mountain Bloom LLC, a shell company she had established nearly a decade ago to protect her assets. Every contract went through her trusted manager, Lara, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with unwavering loyalty. When Lara brought her the new rental agreement, complete with detailed requests from the clients, Elaine simply placed her reading glasses gently on her nose and read through each line slowly. But when she reached the section titled, Special Client Requests, her eyes paused. There it was. One clause stood out clearly. Minimize the appearance of elderly local staff during the wedding day to maintain a modern and refined aesthetic. She didn't need to ask. She knew exactly who had requested that and why. Natalie had never hidden her distaste for Elaine's southern simplicity. For someone like her, everything had to be polished, curated, luxurious, even the past. But what hurt most wasn't Natalie's demand. It was Brandon's silence, his quiet agreement, his quiet betrayal, and then came the text from him, brief, clipped, without greeting or warmth. Mom, maybe it's best if you don't attend. Natalie's a little concerned about the image. Hope you understand. Hope you understand. That single line hit her like a blow to the chest. Understand what? Understand that the boy she once nursed through fevers, spoon-fed in the dead of night, and held close during thunderstorms, now saw her presence as embarrassing. Understand that the wooden home, where his father had died in her arms, was now just a wedding backdrop. Elaine didn't cry. She never cried for things like this. Instead, something cold and hollow began to take shape deep within her chest. Not because she was excluded, but because she realized that her son was no longer the little boy who once ran barefoot through these woods, laughing and saying, "One day I'll marry my wife right here, okay, Mom?" Lara watched her carefully, as if waiting for reaction, a flash of anger, a rejection of the contract. But Elaine merely nodded and said in a whisper, soft tone, "Go ahead, sign it. No changes. As written." And in that moment, everything was sealed. She didn't need to show up. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to stand at the altar. Because this altar, every stone, every shingle was already her voice. All she had to do was wait for the day. A day not far off when music would swell, when a white wedding dress would cross the wooden threshold, when hundreds of eyes would turn to watch the bride and groom walk down the aisle. That would be the moment when truth revealed itself. No announcement. No microphone, no spotlight, just a quiet nod, and Evergreen Estate would remind them all this place belongs to her. Elaine stepped out of her office, the chill wind brushing through her silver hair as her eyes gazed toward the blazing red maples in the distance. This autumn would be different, not because of the falling leaves, but because, for the first time, she had let others draw their wedding story on the very foundation she had built with sweat, tears, and boundless love. And in that silence, Elaine knew she was not alone. Because Evergreen, that home, still belonged to her, and it would never betray her. Beneath the ancient oak trees encircling Evergreen Estate, the morning sun spilled golden light across the garden, soft and warm, like a painting from long ago. It was a scene deeply familiar to Elaine Foster, the woman who had spent over 30 years of her life here. This place that had once been a home, a labor of love, and the last remaining legacy after her husband passed. Today Evergreen wore a new face, resplendent, elegant, filled with music and blossoms, ready to host the kind of wedding Elaine had once dreamed of being the most sacred moment of her life. But not like this. Elaine walked slowly along the cobbled path, a small box wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thin cream ribbon in her hands. Inside was a handkerchief she had kept for over 30 years, a simple gift, but full of meaning. She had embroidered it herself with pale blue thread when Brandon was just 5. The words, "Brandon, my sunshine," were still faintly visible, though the stitches had faded with time. It was something she had always planned to give him on the day he began his new life, as a blessing from the mother who had loved him with everything she had. She arrived early, not wanting to mingle with the crowd, and perhaps a part of her still hoped Brandon might set aside a moment for his mother before the ceremony began. A hug, a word of thanks, or even just the kind of tight handhold he used to give her as a child whenever he was afraid of thunder. But as Elaine reached the side entrance, a familiar path she had designed herself, leading directly to the wedding garden, a young security guard approached her, his face strained, as though carrying out an instruction he wished he didn't have to enforce. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, eyes lowered. "I was instructed not to let you onto the grounds today." Elaine paused. She didn't understand. "Whose instructions?" she asked, her voice steady but coarse with emotion. "The groom's, ma'am." She looked beyond the trees and saw the rows of white chairs neatly arranged, the floral arch built of pale blue hydrangeas, and satin ribbons dancing in the breeze. Everything was exactly like the dream she had once shared with her son, a fairy tale wedding in their own garden. But today, that dream had been replaced by something cruelly real. Her son, the very boy who was once her sunshine, had given the order to keep her out of the new world he was creating. Brandon appeared not long after. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo, the confident smile of a man used to being photographed and praised. But when he saw his mother standing behind the gate, something in his expression softened. Brandon stepped forward, but didn't cross the threshold. The boundary had already been drawn, not just by the white fence but by pride, misunderstanding, and quiet shame. "Mom," Brandon said, trying to keep his tone calm, "today is Natalie's special day. You know how she is. Your being here might make things awkward." Elaine clutched the small box in her hand. She looked into her son's eyes, the same eyes that once reminded her so much of his father, and she saw the conflict behind the mask. Brandon felt something, but he had chosen silence. chosen to stand beside prestige and optics rather than the love that had raised him. You think I'll ruin your wedding? She asked quietly, sadness laced through every syllable. Brandon didn't answer. His silence cut deeper than any insult. Elaine nodded. I see. Thank you for your honesty. She turned away. She didn't cry. She didn't look back, because she knew, if she did, her heart might not survive it. The small box in her hand still radiated warmth, but her fingers had gone cold. She held it tighter as though it were the last ember of a mother's love, unseen, uninvited but still burning, steady and quiet, like coal glowing beneath the snows of winter. Inside Evergreen, music began to play. Guests found their seats, toasts were prepared, laughter flowed like champagne. No one noticed, or perhaps they pretended not to notice, that the woman who had built this place, who had sacrificed her entire life for her only child, was now walking away, one slow step at a time, carrying a grief without name. It was not the grief of death, but the grief of rejection, a kind of funeral only mothers can understand. Elaine was no longer the mother standing in the wedding crowd, raising her glass for her son's happiness. She was no longer the honored matron of this fairy tale garden. Today, she was just an old woman, standing at the edge of the dream she helped build, pushed out not by strangers, but by the very blood that once called her home, and he did it with silence and sugar-coated excuses. On a late summer afternoon, the Vermont sky was bathed in a gentle golden glow. Wispy clouds drifted slowly across the pale blue, and the soft notes of string music floated from the back garden of Evergreen Estate, the very place that once was a warm wooden home built from the dreams and sweat of Elaine Foster and her late husband. Today, that same garden had been dressed in its finest rows of white chairs neatly arranged, white ribbons fluttering in the breeze, and a red carpet stretched from the front entrance to the ceremony altar. It was picture perfect, everything a bride could dream of. But there was one thing no one at that wedding knew: the foundation of this dream had been built with love, tears, and the sacrifices of a woman now standing quietly behind the estate's iron gate watching. Elaine wasn't dressed to impress. Her silver hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, and in her hands, she held a small ivory-wrapped box. Inside was a simple, priceless gift, a handkerchief embroidered with the name Brandon. A gift she had sewn herself when her son was just 5 years old. Back then, Brandon had suffered a high fever for 3 days, and during those sleepless nights, Elaine had sat by his bed, threading needle and cloth, stitching his name with pale blue thread as if whispering a silent prayer. May you grow strong, may you be happy, may you always remember the hand that held you through your storms. She hadn't come to interrupt the wedding. She had only wanted to place this keepsake in his hand, as a reminder that her love had never left him. But as she approached the gate, a young security guard stepped forward. He checked his list, then glanced up at her with a conflicted but firm look. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said. I was instructed not to let you in. Elaine furrowed her brow. I'm the groom's mother. Yes, I know. But this was a request from the family, specifically from the groom. There was a pause. Elaine felt the air leave her lungs, as if someone had pulled the world out from under her feet. Words she'd never imagined hearing, let alone from the son she had raised. And then, that familiar voice emerged behind the guard. Brandon stepped forward, clad in a sleek black tuxedo, looking polished, grown up, and heartbreakingly unfamiliar. I told you already, Mom, Brandon said quietly, eyes lowered. This is Natalie's day. You don't really fit the atmosphere. If you came in, it might make things uncomfortable. Elaine didn't respond right away. She studied her son's face, searching for traces of the little boy who once clung to her hand crying after school bullies, the boy who used to ride on her back laughing during lazy summer afternoons. But that boy was gone. In front of her now stood a man who had chosen to forget. You could have just said it, she replied softly, her voice calm but bitter. You don't want your mother here. Brandon swallowed hard, still unable to meet her eyes. I'm sorry. This is what's best for everyone. Elaine nodded. I see. Thank you for being honest. She turned and walked away, her steps slow and steady. But no one, not even Brandon, knew that her steps were not those of a cast-out mother, but of a woman who knew the truth behind every detail of this lavish event, from the perfectly strung lanterns to the venue contract signed by a shell company, in which she was the majority stakeholder. Elaine shed no tears. She had cried enough in sleepless nights over hospital bills, tuition, and empty pantries. She had felt enough pain watching her son grow distant, cold, and finally, excluding her from the one moment every mother waits for. But today she was no longer a trembling figure standing outside the story. She was the owner of this land, literally and figuratively. An hour later, as the wedding began, as the officiant raised his hand to begin the ceremony, as the string quartet reached the climax of Canon and Dive, the entire sound system cut out. Then the lights, Then the gates locked. Murmurs turned to panic. The bride, Natalie, snapped at the coordinator. Brandon's face drained of color. And then, through the confusion, Elaine stepped in. No one stopped her, because no one had the right to. She didn't need an invitation. She didn't need permission. This was her house, her land, her legacy. And as she stood beneath the floral archway, among hundreds of stunned guests, she looked directly at her son and spoke, clear, calm, and resolute. You built this day without your mother. But you forgot one thing: you built it on your mother's ground. The silence that followed was no longer awkward, it was seismic. No one moved, no one spoke, because no one could deny the truth that had just cracked open beneath their feet. Then Elaine turned to leave, not in retreat but in triumph. She hadn't ruined the ceremony. She had simply reminded them of one unshakable fact: a mother's love isn't something you discard, replace, or silence. It is the foundation beneath everything, even the happiness her son was now clinging to. And today, with quiet dignity, she reclaimed the voice they had tried to strip away. Under the soft sunlight of an early autumn afternoon in Vermont, where the forest leaves had turned golden and brittle, the Evergreen Estate stood quietly nestled in the valley, like a loyal witness to the lives that had passed through its gates. No one would have guessed that this place, once the setting for over 300 love vows, would become the center of a family scandal whispered across America. The story of Elaine Foster, a 66-year-old former award-winning architect, had exploded across the media with headlines that stunned readers. Kicked out by her son at his wedding, mother shuts down ceremony because she owns the venue. What began as a quiet confrontation soon made national news. A viral video captured the now iconic moment: Elaine, calm and dignified in a deep green velvet dress, stepping into the middle of her son's wedding as the sound system cut out, the lights shut down, and the main doors locked under an emergency override code that only she had access to. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't accuse. She simply looked at Brandon, her only son, the man she had raised alone, and spoke, steady and clear. You built this day without your mother. But you forgot one thing: you built it on your mother's land. That sentence, spoken softly yet with surgical precision, silenced the entire hall. Within hours, news sites across the country ran the story. Curious readers dug into public records and discovered the truth: the Evergreen Estate was not owned by Brandon, as the wedding press releases had suggested. It belonged to a limited liability company, quietly founded and still operated by Elaine, through a longtime business manager. Unbeknownst to the groom or the bride, Elaine had reviewed and signed the venue rental contract herself. She never revealed her identity. She never objected, until that moment. The public was stunned and furious. Natalie's family, well known in Boston's financial circles, couldn't tolerate what they called Brandon's deceit and disgrace. They accused him of hiding his true background, misrepresenting ownership, and worst of all, disrespecting his mother in front of hundreds of guests. The wedding was officially canceled 2 days later. Sponsorship deals, media partnerships, and commercial contracts surrounding what had been dubbed a golden marriage unraveled almost overnight. What was once hailed as an elegant, modern union became the internet's latest cautionary tale. On Twitter, the hashtag #KMotherOffTheVenue trended nationwide. Brandon became a viral symbol of entitlement, of the generation willing to sever roots to build glittering facades. He lost more than a fiancé. Brandon's reputation in the creative industry collapsed. Brands he collaborated with rushed to scrub his image from their platforms. Public statements were issued. Partnerships put on hold pending ethical review. His social media posts flooded with harsh criticism. Some even sent letters to his office, demanding he publicly apologize to his mother. And what did Elaine do? Nothing. She declined all interview requests. She stayed off TV. She posted nothing. The only public action she took was to hang a hand-painted wooden sign on the gates of Evergreen Estate, temporarily closed for personal reasons. Many assumed she was celebrating a victory, but the truth was far from triumph. In the days that followed, Elaine lived quietly. She saw no visitors. Each morning, she walked through the garden, trimming lavender, pruning wild roses. She never reopened her wedding booking office, even though couples across the country begged for a chance to marry at the now iconic venue, which had unintentionally become a symbol of maternal dignity rejected. One afternoon, she opened an old wooden drawer in her study and pulled out a dust-covered photo album. Each page held a memory, a wedding she had helped host, lauder tears, thank you notes. Near the back, one photo stood out, a black and white image of Elaine and her late husband on their wedding day, standing in the very garden Brandon had tried to claim as his own. In the picture, she was a simple Southern girl, smiling in a handmade dress, standing beside the man she loved for life. Now he was gone, and her only son had turned away, and the garden once alive with celebration felt dimmed by betrayal. Elaine closed the album gently, no tears, no sighs, just a long, quiet breath. Some things in life cannot be repaired, but the truth had been spoken, not to destroy but to defend her dignity. Not just hers but for every parent ever dismissed for being too simple, too unrefined, too real in a world obsessed with appearances. A week later, she received an anonymous letter, just one line, "I'm sorry, Mom," no name, no signature. But she knew it was Brandon, because the handwriting, the careful slant of each letter, was the same she had taught him when he was 6. She could still remember guiding his small hand across lined paper, letter by letter. Elaine folded the letter and placed it inside the wooden box that held the embroidered handkerchief she made decades ago, stitching her son's name with love during a feverish night long past. Then she closed the box and whispered to no one in particular, "Real love doesn't need to be loud, but it will never accept being erased." That was how she ended the chapter, not with fanfare but with pride, and how she began something new built not on blind hope, but on self-respect. The one thing no mother should ever have to lose. At the foot of the Vermont hills, as autumn quietly prepared to give way to the dry chill of winter, the air still held a certain gentleness in every breeze. The trees had turned, blending shades of gold, rust, and deep red like a canvas painted with memories. On a pale afternoon, Elaine sat alone by the window of the old timber house. The cup of chamomile tea in her hands had long since gone cold. She didn't drink it, she simply sat, silently watching the garden beyond the porch, once filled with lavender bushes and white roses she and her husband had planted together. Now, that same land had become a popular wedding photo destination, where couples held hands and stepped into new chapters of their lives. But it was also the very spot where she had been shut out by her own son, on what should have been one of the most sacred days of his life, Brandon's wedding. The truth had already come out. Local outlets, and even a few national media stations, ran the story a mother barred from her son's wedding, only to stop the entire ceremony when she revealed she was the rightful owner of the wedding venue the couple had unknowingly attempted to claim. The incident sparked fiery debates. Some labeled Elaine a bitter, vindictive mother, while others stood firmly behind her, arguing that she had only reclaimed something that should have been offered out of love, not stripped away through exclusion. Brandon was dragged through public outrage. Natalie's family quickly called off the engagement once they discovered Brandon had not only hidden the truth about his mother, but had also lied about the venue's origin, boasting that it had been arranged through close personal contacts. They had no intention of marrying their daughter to a man who betrayed his own mother. Brandon, once a promising young creative director, saw contract after contract dissolved. His future in the industry slowly collapsed. Within a single month, he had lost his reputation. Friends distanced themselves. No one wanted to be associated with a man publicly branded as someone who humiliated his own mother. Those who once admired him now passed around the same viral clip the moment Elaine calmly stepped onto the altar, her eyes neither furious nor desperate, but quietly broken, as she said, "You built this day without your mother. But you forgot you built it on her land." When the storm faded, when the news cycle moved on, when the cameras turned elsewhere and internet outrage jumped to the next controversy, Brandon was left to sit with the silence. A month isn't long, but it was long enough for him to realize his greatest mistake wasn't excluding his mother from his wedding. It was letting pride and artificial prestige blind him to the woman who had weathered storms, emotional, financial, physical, to raise him alone, and then he discarded her, as if she had never existed. He returned to Evergreen Estate on a quiet Saturday. No announcement, no warning, just the sound of tires slowing before the white gate. The gate wasn't locked, just as a mother's heart never truly closes. Brandon stepped through, carrying a small wooden box. His posture no longer bore the rush or arrogance of before. The winter wind crept under his collar, but he didn't flinch. He didn't rush. He walked inside to the old kitchen where his mother still sat, in her same hand-knitted sweater, holding the same cup of cold chamomile tea. Elaine didn't act surprised. She simply looked up, her eyes calm as if there had never been a storm. Brandon didn't know what to say, so he simply opened the box. Inside was a simple, aged piece of cloth, a handkerchief, ivory-colored and frayed at the edges. Stitched in fading brown thread was one word, Brandon. He placed it on the table and said nothing. Finally, in a slow, unsteady voice, he whispered, "I forgot what really matters." "I'm sorry, Mom." Elaine didn't cry. She was never one to cry easily. Life had forged her in iron, not glass. But in her chest, something shifted, a small fracture reverberating from deep within. Not because of the apology, but because the son she once lost had quietly returned. "I don't need an apology," she said gently. "I need you to remember respect doesn't come from blood. It comes from action. From how you treat the one who carried your life on her back, Silence followed, but not the kind that weighed heavy. It was a silence of listening, of forgiveness, of a new beginning. Outside, pine needles drifted down like blessings from the oncoming winter. Brandon didn't ask to hug her. He didn't plead for grand gestures of redemption. He simply sat across from her. 2 cups of tea, one old handkerchief, a piece of land steeped in memory, and a second chance not born from excuses but from awakening. Life can be cruel, but awareness is the seed of resurrection, and sometimes, an afternoon in quiet company with your mother, no words, no theatrics, is the deepest apology there is. No tears, no speeches, just enough humility to mean it. There's one lesson every parent must learn, often in the most painful way. You can raise a child with all your love and sacrifice, but you can't force them to learn gratitude. Love at times isn't returned with appreciation, but with indifference, even shame. Some children grow up wrapped in warmth, only to grow cold inside. They fear their parents will seem too simple, too unpolished. They fear that their parents' quiet love might dull the spotlight they chase, the flawless image they hope to show the world. Elaine was once a mother like that, one who believed that if she just loved enough, her son would always look back with gratitude. But she forgot one thing: gratitude doesn't come from blood. It comes from being taught to value what matters. Brandon wasn't taught that, not by her, but by a world obsessed with appearances, status, and silent rankings. And so the boy she once held close turned away, closed his heart, and cut her out of the most important day of his life, as if she had never existed. But what made Elaine remarkable wasn't her anger. It wasn't some grand act of revenge. It was her quiet dignity. She didn't come to crash a wedding. She came to remind her son every castle needs a foundation, and the ground Brandon chose to build his fairy tale on was the very land where Elaine had laid every stone, every beam, every buried dream. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to stand still. And when others trample your trust, the most noble thing you can do is refuse to sink to the level they chose. Because sometimes, the loudest form of revenge is quiet composure, a gaze that doesn't judge, a voice that doesn't tremble, and a line as sharp as any blade. You built all of this without me, but you built it on my ground. In the end, family cannot survive on unconditional surrender. It must be built on mutual respect. A mother can forgive, but she should never trade her dignity to hold a place in a child's life that no longer honors her. And the final message here: it isn't about pain. It isn't about exposure. It's about awakening that love does not mean silent endurance. And sometimes, walking away from a table full of hurt is how you protect what's left of yourself. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share, or subscribe. It gives Sarah Stories the strength to keep bringing you more meaningful stories. Stories that speak not only to the mind, but to the soul.